10, verses 1 to 23. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day, at about 3 in the afternoon, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Simon, 3 men are looking for you. So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." Peter went down and said to the men, "I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" The men replied, "We have come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say." Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests.
As we imagined in the narrative just now, the disciples must have been very surprised when Jesus suddenly announced that they were moving on from Capernaum. It must have seemed completely illogical to them. Things were going so well in Capernaum. Mark tells us that the whole town had gone to see him the previous day, and there was already a crowd waiting to see Jesus that morning. So why leave? Surely Jesus still had a lot to do there. Peter's friends must have been even more surprised when he suddenly decided to travel to Caesarea to meet with a Roman soldier called Cornelius. This is because up until then Peter and the other apostles thought that Jesus had only come for the Jews, so who they believed to be God's one and only chosen people. And more than that, Jews at that time, including Peter, regarded people who weren't Jews, the Gentiles, as unclean and unacceptable to God. So they wouldn't associate them and certainly wouldn't go into their homes. So think how surprised Peter's friends must have been when he just coolly stated that he was going off to stay with a Roman. Again, it must have seemed completely illogical to them. Now these 2 seemingly illogical decisions made by Jesus and Peter have something in common. It's easy to see now, looking back, that both decisions were absolutely the correct ones to make and pivotal to the ministries of both Jesus and Peter. And both decisions were made after they'd been praying, somewhere quiet by themselves. Now in Jesus' case, he got up very early in the morning while it was still dark and went by himself to pray in what's described as a solitary place. I imagine it was being on top of a small hill watching the sunrise over the Sea of Galilee. But it doesn't matter where it was, other than it was peaceful and by himself. In Peter's case, it was on the roof of a friend's house. And now you might think it's a bit strange to climb on a roof to pray. But of course houses in that part of the world at that time had flat roofs, in fact often still do, which had sort of stairs going up to them. So for Peter, sitting on a roof was a bit like us sitting in our garden. He didn't have to climb a ladder or balance precariously on sloping tiles or anything like that. So please don't take this passage too literally and start climbing onto the roof of your house to pray, especially not at this time of year. I don't want to hear about any roof-related injuries or the fire brigade having to be called out to get you back down again. So what does all this tell us today? It tells us 5 things. First, it tells us that we need to pray so that we can hear God telling us what to do. We must remember that if Jesus, the Son of God, needed to pray, then we can be absolutely certain that we need to pray as well. And similarly, if Peter, who was the rock on which the church was built and had been filled with the Spirit at Pentecost, needed to pray, then so do we. It would be stupid and arrogant to think that we can do God's work without bothering to listen to him, when Jesus and Peter and the countless great men and women of God throughout the generations have needed to pray. Second, we need to set aside reasonable length of time to pray. Jesus got up while it was still dark to have plenty of time, and Peter was on the roof long enough for him to get hungry. So Jesus and Peter obviously set aside quite a bit of time to pray. I realise it can be difficult to set aside time to pray because we're in the habit of being busy and not having much spare time, filling our lives with all sorts of things. But that's no excuse. We need to create time and by making it a priority. Now, there's nothing wrong with snatching just a few minutes or even seconds to pray in response to something that's just happened or you just heard about, shooting up what I often described as arrow prayers to God about something in particular. Or when you suddenly need help from God, like when I'm writing a sermon. But you need much longer than that to properly listen to God. To hear what he's saying to you. At least half an hour, or preferably several hours. A whole day in a retreat centre is ideal. Perhaps if you've got more spare time than usual during a lockdown, then perhaps it would be a great idea to get into the habit of using this time to spend time listening to God. The third thing we need to do is get rid of distractions so that we can hear God clearly. This is why Jesus and Peter went off by themselves to somewhere quiet where they wouldn't be distracted. And it's not just being somewhere quiet that's important. It's even more important to have quiet in our heads, free from distracting thoughts. It's no good going off and spending all day in a retreat centre, for example, and then worry about all the things you need to do when you get home, or keep checking your phone for messages, or looking at Facebook to see how many people have liked that you're at the retreat centre. Many of us aren't good with silence. We put on the radio when we're driving or working, and many people find silence in a conversation embarrassing and combat this by talking non-stop. Silence when we're praying is a good thing. It gives God a chance to get a word in edgeways. Fourth, we We must be open to the various ways that God communicates with us. We heard that God spoke to Cornelius through an angel. And there are several other times in the New Testament when an angel passes on a message. Just think of Mary and the shepherds who we heard about over Christmas. And it still happens today. I've heard of a few people who have been given a message by an angel. We also heard that Peter was given a vision or a picture by God and heard God describing it in what to Peter was an audible voice. In my experience, God often tells us things through pictures. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's very true. And it's easy to remember a picture. I mean, I can still vividly recall pictures that God gave me from many years ago. And sometimes, as in Peter's case, a picture develops and God explains what it means as it's changing. And when we're told the Spirit spoke to God, and the Spirit spoke to Peter, which from the different description suggests that it wasn't the same voice that he'd heard before. It was like a different voice he heard. So it probably came as a thought that came into his head, which Peter recognised as being from God. And sometimes the Spirit speaks to us through what other people say to us and through what we see happening, through what we experience. And fifth, it tells us that when we listen to God, we must be prepared to hear him tell us to do something unexpected. Jesus probably wasn't expecting what he heard that morning. Why move on when things were going so well in Capernaum with a crowd waiting for him? And why move on when it was so much more convenient to stay at Peter's house? And for Peter, what he heard was even more surprising, as it was contrary to his Jewish beliefs and traditions. The vision of the animals and God's accompanying instructions told Peter he must leave behind his Jewish customs and go with the 3 men to Caesarea to take the good news to the Gentiles, as strange as it seemed to Peter at that time. So, when we listen to God, we must be prepared to hear him telling us what to do, even when those things seem strange. Things that challenge our preconceived ideas, things that don't even seem possible. We should especially expect at this time, during the COVID-19 crisis, at a time when we can't do what we've done before. We must expect these things, must expect to hear unexpected things at times like this. Because it's now that there's new opportunities to do God's work and build his kingdom. So expect to hear something you weren't expecting. Perhaps God is challenging you, like Peter, to start working with people you wouldn't normally associate with. But conversely, don't expect to always hear God telling you to do something new and exciting. For example, when I was on my last retreat before I took early retirement, while I was still expecting to work for quite a few more years, I was, as usual, badgering God about what he wanted me to do. God told me that it would be obvious at the time. To be honest, I didn't find that very helpful. I really thought that God could have done a bit better than that. But 6 months later, after I'd left work, it all made perfect sense. He couldn't explain to me exactly what was going to happen, who was going to approach me, etc., etc. He just told me, just be patient. It will be clear when it happens. I think most of us would like to know in advance what God's plans are for us. In fact, I was talking to a minister doing an MDR today, and he said what a shame it was that God wasn't on Zoom or even email. It makes life so much easier. But that's not the way God works. Think about Peter in Joppa. God didn't tell him that he was going to be taking the good news to the Gentiles until a couple of minutes before he needed to make that decision. This is why it's important to keep listening to God. we need to keep giving God an opportunity to speak to us and guide us when the time is right, every step along the way. So, remember that you will hear God speaking to you if you do these 5 things. Number 1, recognise the need to pray and listen to God. Number 2, set aside decent amounts of time to pray. Number 3, get rid of distractions when you pray, both external and internal. 4, be open to the various ways that God can communicate with us and does communicate with us. And 5, be prepared to hear God tell us to do something unexpected. You are God's precious child who he loves very much, and God wants to get you involved in what he's doing. So of course he wants to speak to you. You just need to listen. Now, predictably, we're going to have a time of prayer in a minute to give us the opportunity to listen to God. But first we'll prepare ourselves for this through the words of our next song. Speak, O Lord, as we come to you.